So if you want to learn a language quickly, which is more important, input or output? Now, if you watched any other video on this topic, you'll know that people can be fairly divided on this. Here on YouTube, there are entire channels dedicated to one of these sides of the input-output debate. So with so many divided opinions, how should you approach this question? How do you figure out whether input or output is more important when it comes to language learning? Whenever you're faced with a choice like this, try to ask a question that goes deeper than the choice you're being presented with. Is there something more important or more fundamental than input or output? Now, before I answer this question, we need to quickly define what we're talking about. Now, when we say input, we're talking about activities like reading or listening, where you are taking the language in. And then output activities are things like writing and speaking, where you are producing the language. Now, there are several language learning influencers that say, forget trying to speak for 6 months or more and focus only on input when you're learning a language. This is the key to getting better. And then there are language learning influencers that oppose that and say, forget that advice, speak from day one. Now, in previous videos, I've compared the world of language learning to the world of dieting. Often you'll find nutrition experts debating about whether we should be eating more carbs or more fats. And in the sports world, you'll often hear commentators debating about the importance of offense versus defense. Offense wins titles. No, defense wins titles. Now, I think it's human nature to create these dichotomies where we compare two things that appear to be in opposition and then debate the importance of one over the other. But in many instances, the thing that we actually need is balance. Now, as someone who has studied and taught languages for many years, I've seen that in order to achieve a high level of fluency in any given language, a student needs a strong combination of both input and output. Now, I feel like I can't just say this without providing more evidence because some of you probably already have strong opinions on this debate. So to back this up, for the input-only crowd, we need to have a conversation about latent speakers, sometimes referred to as receptive bilinguals or passive bilinguals. Now, latent speakers often are the children of immigrant families or the children of native indigenous people that speak a language that is slowly being phased out with time. Now, often latent speakers have very good listening skills as they listen to the language a lot as a child, but they have limited speaking ability. Now, there was a study done in 2008 where they wanted to understand what is involved for latent speakers of indigenous languages in Alaska to develop their speaking skills to a high level of fluency. Now, they highlighted that the beginner learners had difficulty in orally retelling a story in their heritage languages, even though their comprehension of the story was good, as evidenced by their descriptions in English. And at Real Fast Spanish, we've also worked with latent speakers in our Spanish school over the years, where in many instances, these students were not allowed to speak Spanish at home, even though their parents were doing so, in an effort to get the children to assimilate to the new culture in the US. And in my experience, these students do have wonderful listening skills, but often struggle to produce simple sentences. Now, aside from the evidence provided by latent speakers that time spent outputting the language is in fact very important for developing fluency, there are skills outside of vocabulary and grammar which are important for being able to produce a language well. Now, the most obvious is pronunciation, which is a physical skill. It involves moving the mouth and the tongue in ways that a student isn't used to. And these new mouth movements and tongue placements will take time to develop, but they will improve through muscle memory. But this only happens when a student is outputting the language. Then there is circumlocution, which is a skill where a student develops the ability to talk around a concept when they don't have some particular vocabulary or they've forgotten it in the moment of speaking. There's also stress management. Often speaking can be stressful as we're afraid of making mistakes or being judged. Now again, this only improves when we're spending time producing the language. Now this was talked about in the study with the indigenous speakers in Alaska, where the students were afraid to make mistakes in front of the elders, and this fear factor only really improved through practice. Then the other thing when it comes to outputting a language is conversational soft skills. Things like body language, confidence, using non-verbal cues, asking great questions, picking useful anecdotes, and telling stories in an interesting way. Now, these are skills that come when we spend time outputting the language. And if you're a student that has been heavily focused on input only, you may find that some of these skills are limitations for you when you try to speak. Now, of course, all of that being said, there is the other side of the debate that we need to address. So let's consider the output-only crowd. One of the biggest challenges that we see with students that focus too much of their efforts on output is limited vocabulary, grammar, and use of common phrases. These students tend to get good at skills like circumlocution. They can get their ideas across, but not in the most accurate way. Now, part of the problem is that these students tend to plateau very quickly. They develop their skills to the point that they can express the most simple ideas that they need. For example, they can order food, they can ask basic questions and give simple commands, but then they just use these ideas over and over and over again and tend not to add to these skills over time. Now, another problem that output-only students have is that they tend to ingrain and form long-term bad habits, particularly with word use or grammar rules. It can then take a lot of time to break these habits in the future. So if you feel like this applies to you, if you've been output-only focused for a long period of time, then you will need to adjust a little bit and spend some of your time working on input. So if we pause for a moment and say, given that both input and output are essential components of a strong study routine, two questions come up. What are the best ways to practice input and output? And should you spend more time on input or output? Now, in my recent video, The Fastest Way to Learn a New Language, I talk about a simple theory that highlights that not all practice is created equally. There are effective and ineffective ways to practice both input and output. And a simple metric that is even more important than this choice of input and output is learning. It is possible to spend lots of time on input or output and not learn anything if we're doing it in the wrong way. Now, several online language learning influencers talk about the importance of something known as comprehensible input, because the opposite, incomprehensible input, will not lead to improvement and learning. Now, I've already done a video where I break down the problems with the term comprehensible input in more detail, because in general, I have a love-hate relationship with this term, but I'm not going to go over all of that here. In short, whether something is 0% comprehensible, 50% comprehensible, or 90% comprehensible, you only start to learn when you take the time to figure out and study the parts that you don't understand. You've got to fill in those gaps by using a transcript or using subtitles or a translating app or asking a teacher or asking a Spanish native friend. Whenever you can make a connection in something that you are studying on the input side that you didn't have before through asking questions or studying the text, that's where the learning happens. Now, similarly, on the output side, if you are trying to say something and you can't quite say it, you're struggling to find the words to express an idea, rather than just skipping it or finding a different way to say it, you've got to take note of that thing that you can't say so you can look it up later, or have a Spanish teacher or a Spanish friend help you fill in that gap. That way, learning is taking place every time a knowledge gap is getting filled on both the input and the output sides. Now, the last part of this conversation is, how should you structure your time? Given that both input and output are important, should you dedicate equal time to both, or should you spend more time on one or the other? Now, as I mentioned, learning is the most important metric. It's more important than input or output. But that said, I would argue that on average, we should spend more time on input activities than output activities. Now, some might interpret this to mean that I think that input is more important than output, but I'm not saying that. Output is still incredibly important if you want to speak the language well. The reason that I say that we should spend more time on input and output is that in general, it is easier to learn through input than output. This is because we're more likely to run into phrases, vocabulary, grammar, and expressions that we aren't already familiar with. Now, when we're in output only mode, if we have a way of expressing an idea, we will just go with that. And if it's grammatically correct, we move on. But there might be a better way of saying something. For example, if we want to say in Spanish, "This is interesting to me," "Esto es interesante para mí." Now, this is a grammatically fine sentence. It works and people understand it. But natives might often say in this situation, "Esto me interesa," or "Esto me parece interesante." Now, I would argue that these two sentences are better because they are a more common way of expressing this idea in Spanish. But if we spend the majority of our time on output, we miss this kind of learning. Now, when I was younger, I had a teacher tell me once that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, because we should be listening twice as much as we speak in order to learn. I would say that this is a useful truism, but I would recommend an even higher ratio for learning a language. For me, my Spanish skills grew the fastest when I was in a phase that involved 1 day per week on output and 6 days a week on input. So if you have 1 hour every day to work on your Spanish, you could spend 6 days a week on input, about 6 hours, and 1 day a week on output. Said in a different way, if you can spend approximately 80% of your time on input, learning as much as you can, and then 20% of your time on output, where again you try to learn as much as you can, this would be ideal. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule, but this was what worked really well for me. Now, I often find myself working as a Spanish teacher trying to balance these two sides of the debate with specific students. When I find a student that is heavily input focused, often 100% of their time, I recommend they spend at least some time trying to speak. Half an hour to an hour a week is enough. Then for the student that spends the majority of their time speaking or looking for speaking opportunities whenever they can, they might often be doing 2 to 3 speaking sessions per week with very little input and study time. I would recommend that these students drop at least a speaking session or two and try to find 20 to 30 minutes every other day where they can focus on input and learning. All right, now I pass this to you. Let's have a conversation. Let me know in the comments, do you agree? Do you disagree? What did I miss? Are there any other aspects of this topic that I didn't cover? Please share your thoughts below. I would love to have a conversation with you and hear what you think about this popular language learning debate. Okay, on that note, until next time, hasta pronto.